That was the only reason why I ended up going to the hospital that day and getting a psychiatric evaluation and being admitted into the psychiatric hospital. He would try to convince me to not identify as queer, but as a child of God. Because later on, after leaving, I did learn that what they were doing was a form of conversion therapy.
Hey everyone, my name is Shelise Ansola, and this is Cults to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and finding healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. If you're listening only and you would prefer to see our faces, head over to my YouTube channel, Cults to Consciousness. You can like, subscribe, hit the bell. It means a lot if you leave a comment for the algorithm to really help us get more visibility. So today's guest, I'm super excited to have this conversation, to tell her amazing story. She is a queer Latinx survivor. She's an advocate in Boston. And after surviving some pretty crazy religious abuse, she is now helping others and speaking out against these religious abuses. She is helping others see through people who are ill-equipped to be spiritual leaders, and talking about LGBTQ policies and the ambiguities that are harming these people. So, thank you so much for joining me. We have Noemi Uribe.
Yeah, you did it.
I pronounced your name right?
You did, yes.
Amazing. So, you have a pretty wild story. Let's just go over the basics and what the listeners can expect. So, you grew up in a Latinx Pentecostal church, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, and we're going to talk about how strict and all the different things that you went through with that. And then you landed at Hillsong in Boston, which you thought you were going to be able to explore your sexuality and your faith questions there, and that was not the case, correct?
Yeah, just to bring it down to one sentence, yes, that's it.
To distill it down into one sentence.
Yeah.
Now, on the other side, you are an advocate, you have your own podcast, you are being a guest speaker at different places, and people are really starting to pay attention. So I'm so excited to get into your story. Anything else you want to add before we dive in?
No, I'm excited. I don't know how much I can talk about my podcast because it's not out yet, but very soon it will be.
Cool. So let's just dive right into it. Let's start at the beginning.
Okay. So I grew up in a Latinx Pentecostal church, like you mentioned. And growing up there, my dad, by the time I was about 5 years old, he was already a minister and moving into being an associate pastor within more of the evangelical ecclesiastical way of viewing church, or Christian church. And I then move up into being more seen as a poster child. We were at that church until about when I turned 11. We moved to Mexico, and then he then transitioned to being more of a missionary. So we would go to different places. I would help him out with the kids. And at first I thought it was, it was what I grew up in. It was really fun for me. I could get to know people. People knew who I was. People knew my family. Everyone from my dad's side of the family was within that church. So I was like third generation because it went from my grandpa to my uncles. And then we were like the next generation, my cousins and I, of like helping in leadership and being a part of it. And it's a bigger church organization that still exists. So my dad ended up passing away in 2012 in Mexico. And that really started my shift into questioning even more. I already had a few questions about the theology. For example, I had to wear a head covering when going into the church. And I didn't understand why. I didn't find scriptures to support it. But yet I was being told that that's what I had to do. I had to wear skirts. I wasn't allowed to wear anything above the knee. If it was right above the knee, that was like already being a little, like pushing it, being a little rebel.
Wait, is this within church or in general you weren't allowed to wear pants?
In general, like,
wow.
Even if, outside of church, if it was something within school, if it was a sport, I had to request permission to wear a skirt to play that sport.
Wow.
Or to do that activity. Yeah. For religious purposes, things like that. So it was pretty difficult as a kid who didn't feel comfortable wearing skirts, who had gender dysphoria wearing skirts. But that was something that I was asked to do. And at the time, like, I didn't feel like I had a voice or agency. So I just went with it. So I had to wear skirts. It was easier in Mexico because uniforms require skirts for people who are females. And as someone at the time who identified that way, then as a woman, then I was wearing a skirt. But anyway, so those are a few of the things, like no makeup, no jewelry, skirts, what else? No piercings. Very, very strict. The hair was also a really big thing.
Really?
That I wasn't allowed to cut my hair. I could trim it in order to keep it healthy, but if you cut it too much, let's say up to your shoulders, that was already like that's too much. Your hair is your glory and you should be leaving your hair long. So that was something that was also controlled growing up, and I really hated it because I didn't like my hair.
Oh no. Have you found that seems like a Native American tradition as well, like the not cutting your hair. Were there parallels there between indigenous cultures or totally separate?
Yeah, totally separate. So they would take from a part of the scriptures. I don't even remember what they would use to say that your hair is your glory and that's why you shouldn't cut it.
Oh.
A few other churches like the UPCI church or the UPC church do it as well. And so the church I was a part of, which is the Apostolic Assembly of Faith in Christ Jesus, that one also not the same strict or the same level of strictness as a UPC, but they still didn't allow you to like cut your hair drastically. So like the haircut I have now, I would be a heathen or like a heretic or something.
Oh my gosh.
Which I don't care anymore, obviously.
Good for you.
But yeah. So anyway, fast forward, those are the kinds of rules I had, and I viewed them as rules, because that's the reality. Like if I did something off of that script, off of that set of things that I had to do, then I was viewed as a rebel, and then therefore a bad image for my parents who were raising me within this church. So that was really difficult to navigate, as internally I was starting to ask myself questions and about myself and my gender identity and my sexual orientation, but I had to hide because of the theology that the church had that was very strict, very, very binary, very heterosexual. So those were some of the things that I kind of had to endure, but for me, it was it was something normal that I was going through. I thought everyone had to go through that, because I never had the ability to voice what I had.
With all of these rules, were there any sort of punishments, or was it more just like the psychological punishment of you're a bad person and you're sinning?
So there could be more intense punishments. For example, going up to the front of the church and saying you had sinned or that you were being a rebel. Mainly because if a woman, and I hated this, if a woman were to wear something above the knee that were to tempt a guy, then you were responsible for whatever he fell for. Which is very frustrating.
Yes.
And my sisters and I would always speak up and be like, I don't give a fuck what, I don't know if I can cuss.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. It's like, I don't give a fuck what he's doing, but like, he's not my responsibility.
Yeah.
But they would view it as that. They would remove all accountability from men in general and place it on the women. So in a sense, yes, you did have some formal punishment of going into the pastor's office and the pastor's wife, and my mom would sometimes help because she was a seamstress, and they would unsew the bottom of your skirt in order to fold out what they fold.
The hem.
I don't know what they call it. Yeah, the hem. So they would unfold it so your skirt would be a little bit longer and go below the knee if it was above the knee.
Oh my gosh.
Or they would have head coverings, which we would call veils. They would have a whole bunch stacked that my mom would make at home and she would bring over, and her as the associate pastor's wife and the main pastor's wife, they would hand them out to women who were walking in who didn't have any head covering. So it was very social punishment, I would
Yeah.
say, because you felt like you had to fit the standard with the other women in the room. And for men, it was really not a big thing. Like if they were wearing shorts one day walking into church, which they supposedly weren't allowed to do, no one would tell them anything, and they would just be like, "Hey, next time, just bring some pants."
So
So it
frustrating.
was really frustrating. Yeah.
Geez, were other women kind of feeling that way of like, this is BS, or was everyone pretty much on the same page as to the rules and what they had to do?
I know within my friend group, we definitely were like the kids and young people I grew up around. Um, we would obviously talk after church or within our own setting, and we were all very frustrated, especially the women. The guys didn't get it because they obviously weren't subjected to that kind of rules and regulations to their body. But as women, we did feel really like it was just really difficult to navigate and have to follow all of these things. Like I know a few of my friends who would keep clothes in their trunk and just in case when they walked into church, something they were if they were called to the side and saying their sleeve was too short, they had a sweater or something. So yeah, we were very frustrated, and we would constantly have conversations. I know I would have conversations with my parents all the time about it because I wanted to wear pants, and they would say no, like you can't do that. Um, and or we would talk to the pastor's wife as a friend group jokingly and say, "Oh, come on, I'm not going to go to hell if I wear pants today." And they would just laugh and be like, "It's not about that." And I'm like, "Okay, well then why are you requiring me to do this?"
Yeah.
So it was just quite a bit all over the place, honestly. But the frustration was there.
Yeah, that's so demoralizing and also objectifying. Like, don't wear makeup,
Yes.
sleeves. I mean, it was similar in Mormonism, how I grew up, where you had to have like cap sleeves, and it used to be not above the knee, and they've recently changed it. They're like slowly getting higher, the requirements.
Wow.
But yeah, I remember being called out. Like we would go to young women's camps, and I think I had like a tankini that showed an inch of my stomach, and they put I called it the shame shirt because they like, here, put this t-shirt on to swim in. I'm like, I'm gonna
Oh,
drown in
wow.
the lake in this thing because it's this enormous t-shirt, and then everyone knows like, oh, Shelise was being immodest, and it's so humiliating, and to have them
Yeah.
do that where you have to stand up in your church and your congregation in front of your peers and everyone who is, looks up to you as the pastor's daughter. He was a pastor, right? Pastor?
Yeah, my dad was associate pastor, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, all of that pressure and just wow. It's so frustrating that they try and silence women and shame women and put them into these tiny little boxes. And
Mm-hmm.
I would imagine, and tell me how it was with this, but I would assume that once you get married, it's like, okay, now have all the kids, and you're just supposed to like flip this switch of sexuality that you've been diminishing for so long.
Oh yeah, everything is geared towards having children, obviously. And it's also a Latinx church, and it's very cultural to have a lot of kids and to get married young within the Latinx community. So yeah, it was obviously everyone was like, "Hey, like your train is leaving, got to get on, go get married." Or your biological clock is ticking. And so for me, it was difficult because, like, I obviously didn't have a crush on any guys. And so I would just like pick and choose, like, oh, yeah, if someone would ask me if I like someone, I'd be like, yeah, sure, him, whatever. But I didn't feel any attractions, and I was concerned internally because I felt like I wasn't going to be able to fulfill that for them in the
Mm.
future. And I know a few other people who were also queer who felt the same way, who were also hiding, and that was like a thing we were all dreading having to get to. Once we like graduated high school, maybe going, if some of us went to college, then right after college, because education wasn't really encouraged, or higher education wasn't encouraged as much.
What were the policies, or how did they feel about LGBTQ people? What did you learn? What was your framework growing up around that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the typical within Pentecost or evangelical would be that they believed in the six clobber passages, which are basically, I think that's about 3 in the Old Testament and 2 in the New Testament within the Christian Bible. Just talking about homosexuality being a sin, that it being an abomination to God, that homosexual people aren't going to inherit the kingdom of God. So they would just point out at those 6 verses all the time to demoralize, to dehumanize any homosexual or any LGBTQ person. Obviously, later in life, I learned that was not the truth and was very different. And the history is very important to understand the context. But at the time, that's what I grew up with. And for me, it was really difficult because I didn't want to feel that. I didn't want to identify that way. But that was my reality. So growing up was pretty difficult. I knew from the time I was like 4, because I had a crush on my preschool teacher. By the time I was 6, I was questioning why I couldn't marry a woman.
Really?
And so my parents kind of always had a hint. I know my mom says she kind of always knew, but she just dismissed it in order to not think about it. But for me, it was life, and it was really hard to be within that kind of theology.
Yeah. Wow. How old were they pressuring you to find someone and get married and have kids?
Well, by the time I left their church, I was about 17.
Okay.
So I never really got the pressures. I was getting pressures to date, but I wasn't allowed to date until I was 18. And I had already left their church by then. So yeah.
Was that a bit of a relief for you that you couldn't date till you're 18 because you wouldn't even have to deal with trying to force something that wasn't your own truth?
Yeah. Yeah, it was. At first, it was up to 15, our deadline. My dad, like, kind of came up to us and was like, you can't date until you're 15. Like, boys only want to have sex with you, and dating should only be for marriage. So for me, it was like, okay, that's fine. I don't mind. But my sister, I know one of my sisters would cry and would like beg my dad to let her date because she really liked this boy and he really liked her. And she was like 13 years old. But obviously my dad didn't allow her. And he's like, oh shit, like 2 more years and she's going to be allowed to date. So then he extended it to 18 because of her.
Oh my
gosh.
So
my other sister and I, we're both queer, we were like, okay, that's fine.
Wait, was it a rule within your household, or the entire church had to change because of your sister?
No, that was like an internal household thing. Other families kind of set that rule. But if anyone was going to date, they kind of had to have the blessing from the pastor of like, hey, if this is a good person for you or not. And blessing as in permission.
Wow.
So you would have to go ask the pastor, like if this was a good idea, if you were ready, if this was a good person, if they had a good testimony, that's what they would call it.
Really?
Sometimes. Yeah. So I know some of my friends had a really hard time because they were dating a person or this girl or this guy, and they really liked them and they felt like it was a good match. And the pastor would be like, no, that's not a good match for you. Or they have a bad testimony, or I heard they don't pay tithes, or they don't like to volunteer in church. So that would be a little more difficult. And oftentimes some of them would ignore it. Others wouldn't. They would go forward with it. But it was kind of like, it felt really weird to me of like, why do I have to go to you to get permission to date this person here?
Yeah. No thanks. So that would pretty much, I would assume, limit your dating pool within your church, because were you not allowed to date outside of your religion?
Oh, yeah, no. Outside of the religious organization, if you dated someone, maybe within the UBC church, because I know a few of my friends who did marry someone and it was like, okay. But anything outside of that, outside of the similar theological perspective, they would say you're unequally yoked and you can go to hell. Like, they're going to cause you to sin.
Oh my gosh, that's so aggravating. Okay. Okay, we can move on. So I interrupted your story to go on all of those
No
tangents.
worries.
So continue, please.
It's okay. Yeah, so when my dad ended up passing away in 2012, we were in Mexico. I moved back to the US, moved in with one of my uncles, so one of my dad's brothers. I lived there for a year and a half to finish high school, and then I went up to college in northern Arizona. At this point, my mom was still in Mexico. She was undocumented, so she had to stay in Mexico while we fixed her papers and everything for her residency. But I went to college up in northern Arizona, and I started studying religion there. I felt like I had a void in my life of I couldn't go to my dad anymore to ask questions. So I had to figure out another way to get my questions answered. So I started taking a world religions class, and it was super fascinating to me to learn about Islam and to learn about Judaism from a different perspective and from a more secular and more academic perspective. And then to actually learn about Christianity and the history of it from an outsider or someone who seemed to be an outsider and who didn't have bias, my professors. So that was really, really eye-opening and fascinating to me. And oftentimes the first thing they would tell you is, whatever you know about Christianity, like, you need to leave that at the door because we're going to view it very differently here. And I need you to leave your bias out there and just come with an open mind to learn about the history of it. And obviously, being in a state like Arizona that's very conservative, with students obviously from all over the world and all over the country, it was still pretty difficult for students to go through that. But I was super excited about it, and I went full in, and my eyes were being opened to a new world.
What were some of the things that you learned that you were like, wait, what?
I learned that the theology of the end times theology was one that was invented about 100 years ago. That one was pretty big within Pentecostalism. It still is. And end times theology is basically like that at the end of time, there's a prophecy that there will be a rapture of the church, and then there's going to be a tribulation within the world, and God's going to come down. So it's like this whole timeline of how the world is going to end. And it's used oftentimes within Pentecostalism and evangelicalism sometimes, mainly fundamentalism, to control the masses. It's a fear tactic. And so that was something that was really eye-opening to me because I had grown up believing that I couldn't sin or I couldn't be who I am because I needed to be ready for when God comes to rapture me. And that could happen at any moment at night. So you grew up terrified.
Wow.
And asking for forgiveness every second because it's like, I need to be ready if God comes right now. If I'm not raptured and my parents are, like, what am I going to do? I'm going to be a foster kid in this world that's going to end and I'm going to go to hell. So you're like freaking out half the time. And I know that causes a lot of trauma within people.
Yeah.
And it did for me as well. It took a long time to unlearn, but that one was definitely a pretty big one for me.
Where did it actually come from, or who started that whole story?
So I can't recall his name, but it was just basically this guy who wanted to translate a Bible to be a little bit more digestible for young people. And so he grabbed the Bible. He had never studied religion. He had never studied any type of translation, any ways of doing this. So he just grabbed the Bible one day and started making it a little bit more simpler. And he came across this like kind of theological or this scripture within Revelations, which a lot of theologians have had a hard time like deconstructing it and like understanding it. So he decides to put it together and views this as like, oh my God, the world is going to end this way. This is what Revelation says in a simple matter. And obviously that was not the case. But he then exported this into different countries, into different books and texts, and a lot of evangelicalism, a lot of Pentecostalism, and what we now see as fundamentalism started taking that on as part of their theological perspective. So now when we see fundamentalism in general, that's one of the main criteria to categorize a religion or a denomination within Christianity as fundamentalist, for them to believe in I think it's called dispensationalism. So it'd be the end times theology. So it's quite interesting. And there's so much more you can talk about, but that's like the gist of it. And I may have got a little bit of that wrong, so don't quote me on all of it, because I'm going off of memory. But yeah.
Wow, that is quite the story. Thank you for sharing that. And it's okay. We don't have to fact check. People can Google it if they want to. So you're learning about these religions from an unbiased perspective. Things are starting to fall into place. You're realizing, oh, maybe the church that I grew up in had things a little bit skewed, right? Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, and so now your views on Christianity are changing, but you're not necessarily discarding it. You're like, you know what? I want to find the real Christianity, or something that makes more sense to me, or something that makes more sense as far as the Bible goes and what it's actually saying and what people are translating it to. So then you go to Hillsong, or am I skipping a big chunk of time?
Just a little bit, yeah.
Okay, fill it in.
Okay, so while I was in college, I also joined InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. So it's just a evangelical Christian organization within colleges. So it's like a club. And they have a branch of it is called La Fe, which means Latino Fellowship, or the Faith, if you want to directly translate. So I started joining that in sophomore year. And for me, it was a big eye-opening opportunity, because we were then studying the scripture from a very different perspective. And the beautiful thing that I found there was that I could ask all the questions. Nothing was ever shut down. But we were also trying to view religion from a more unifying perspective. We had a lot of Latino students who were Catholic and didn't grow up within a Pentecostal or evangelical or Protestant in general denomination around them. And within Latinx culture, there tends to be a big divide between Catholicism and Protestantism. Like families are torn apart. I know mine was from my mom's side. And so that was a really big eye-opening moment for me, to bring family together, to bring people to the table from different viewpoints, which was very different from the general view or the general way that InterVarsity is done in a general chapter. So more in the Latinx one, it was a really cool way to have familia within a college campus, where yeah, we had theological differences, but we left those at the door and tried to bring what unified us as people who believed in Christ, or people who believed in this book together. So that was really cool for me to experience. And it was very eye-opening to be able to be at a table where I could have conversations from people who had grown up very differently and believe very differently from me, but we can find commonalities, and have a good debate about the differences, but not worry and focus on that. And it felt like I was in a little bit of my heaven there, of like what it would look like if heaven existed, or I don't know. But anyway, so for me, that was very eye-opening, and it caused me to then look at the church I was growing up in and say, I can't be in something where my friends who I have at this table, who I feel like Jesus is with us in that table, having these conversations, for me to have a church behind me that believes that they're going to go to hell. Like, I don't feel like that's possible. I want everyone to be welcomed at the table, and no exclusions or no terms and conditions for it. So I decided to leave in 2016. January 2016, I went to the pastor and said, I'm done. And he was like, he had been my dad's mentor. And he basically, it was me in the middle, him on my right side, his son in front of me, my sister in front of me as well, circling me, and then his wife on my left side. So they were all around me. And I had a list that I had written out, that I was like, if I can think of 5 things to leave this church, then I'm going to do it. And I had to stop at 10. So that was
gosh.
like a really good key moment for me of like, okay, this is it. So I sat down with my list of 10 things and I said, this is how I feel about your church. This is the reason why I am leaving. I'm here to inform you, not to ask you. So I started reading and I didn't even finish point number 2 when he stops me and he says, you're leaving the truth. I'm not going to let you continue because I've already heard all of this before. And I can't believe it. Your dad would be so disappointed in you. You are going to hell. And he started lifting his Bible. You're leaving the truth. And his wife looked at me. She was like, who twisted you? What did you do? We told you not to go to college so far. So they were getting frustrated and angry at the fact that I had the liberty to think for myself. And I had a different perspective and different theological view. And that was really eye-opening for me because I kind of knew that that was a reality, but seeing it happen firsthand was like, that was like the camel that broke, or the straw that broke the camel's back. Like that was it. I started tearing up because I couldn't believe what was happening in front of me. My sister couldn't say anything to support me because if she did, she could lose her leadership position, and I didn't want to affect anybody. Like, I was just leaving on my own. Like, if you don't want to leave, that's fine. Like, I don't care. It's just me. So when she looks at me like, I can't, and I was like, it's okay. I just sat there, and the first thing that came to my mind in the moment was, like, God's going to fight your battles. You should only sit still. Like, only be, like, it's okay. Like, just be quiet. Let them say what they want. And whatever happens, happens. And so it got to a point where I had enough and I felt like they were going to continue yelling at me. So I interrupted and said, first and foremost, you don't know my father when he passed away. I did. Him and I would have conversations about taking our family out of this church. He was starting to deconstruct. And it's very disrespectful that you were to bring him up in this conversation if you didn't know him at end of life.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. And secondly, I am here to inform you, not to ask you for permission to leave. So this is me. I am leaving your denomination. Please remove me from all membership list and have a good day. God bless you. And I stood up and my sister and I walked out. And that for me was very eye-opening when it came to interactions with pastors and the reality of how they viewed people within that church and in general. And I told myself that moment that I would never let that happen again. But I obviously learned a valuable lesson also going to Hillsong.
Wow. First of all, that's extremely brave of you to do that, and it's difficult. Not everyone can stand up to their family or their pastors and actually have that really hard conversation, which is okay too. It's okay to just kind of slip away and do what you want to do. But for you, I really love that you stood up to them and you took back your power in that moment and you didn't ask for permission. It was like, hey, I'm just doing this for y'all. Like, I don't care whatever you think you're going to think. This is for me and this is what's happening. So good for you. That's amazing.
Yeah. Because I knew politically what it was like within, and when people don't go and inform the pastor or at least send an email to remove them from a list, they're going to continue to keep them, to keep their numbers up. So I was like, I don't want to be used in that way, and you're not going to use my name in that way. I have agency and I'm going to use it. And I could have done it many different ways. I could have just texted them, but I wanted to sit down and for them to see me. And I felt like it was a culmination of what my dad wanted to do, of what him and I had talked about. And I wanted to honor him in that way. And it was very, very, like I said, very eye-opening, and it gave me a lot of agency. It was very traumatic, and I had to process it for years after that in therapy. Just the way, like, it was spiritual abuse. But at the same time, it was very eye-opening to see how I don't want people to be treated with any religious organization.
Mm-hmm. Wow, good for you. I love that so much. So then you go to Boston and you join Hillsong.
Yeah, so I graduate from undergrad, and I get accepted into Boston University. So I made my way here. I'm excited to go to grad school to do my master's in public health. And as I'm here, I reach out to my mentor from InterVarsity because I continue to attend after leaving my parents' church. And I ask her to help me pray to find a church here in Boston that is ethnically and racially diverse, because I didn't want to attend another mono-ethnic church like I did growing up. And I wanted a place where everyone was welcome. So the typical everyone is welcome at the table from different perspectives, different walks of life, all of that. I wanted something different. I wanted something where everyone was felt like they could be themselves. So she prayed with me. I was excited. I started searching. I ended up finding Hillsong, and I go to one of their small groups, and it looks pretty diverse. Pretty early on, like they messaged me pretty quickly to go. And I go to their first volunteer night because they were about to start in Boston, their first Wednesday night service before they launched Sunday. So I go to the first volunteer night right before, and I remember walking in and I see this big sign that says, "Welcome home." And for me, that was like, oh my God, like, is this it? Like, was this one of the signs? And then I look over and I see people, some diversity, way more than what I had grown up seeing within my church. So I was like, I think this is it. Little did I know that the welcome home side had terms and conditions.
Oh no.
But it looked for me as if they were welcoming. Later on, I learned a lot more, but I decided to volunteer, and I got into the host team first, and they would have me at the door welcoming people. This brown person in the midst of a whole bunch of white people welcoming. So obviously it looked good for them and great optics. And I was excited because I wanted to bring more people like me and be a part of being able to diversify it even more. And I then started shifting into the events team to helping out with putting on the whole production, because it was a production. It's not a service.
Yeah. Can you explain to people who aren't familiar with Hillsong? I think they have one here in LA, but can you explain, like, paint the picture for people?
Yeah. So when you would arrive at a Hillsong church, you're most likely going to encounter a line out the door right before a service starts. So you have to stand in line, and there'll be hosts with trays of like donut holes and water and treats, and just very welcoming, huge smiles that they seem a little too nice. But you kind of just accept it for what it is. Then you would walk through the doors. Sometimes there's security, especially out here in the East Coast, not in all venues, but you would walk through the front doors, go through security, and then go into what's called the welcome lounge. And in this welcome lounge, there's like music playing. Sometimes it's secular. Sometimes it's Hillsong music, because they do have 3 bands for young people and for older people. And so they'll have some like popping music going. So you're kind of just like moving to the groove with lighting and TVs that are flashing announcements to like get connected. And there's people, they're handing you like a connect card where you can just put your name and email and they'll contact you to get you connected to any group. So you're very excited and it feels super cool. Everyone's wearing like the most on brand fashion. A lot of them are, not everyone. And then you're brought up to, or the doors are open into the main venue, into the main sanctuary, the main temple, whatever you want to call it. As you're walking in, a host will greet you, and you notice that it's very dark, but there's like some lighting in the front that's like different colors. So it feels like kind of a concert. So you're walking in, you see the lighting, and then a host comes out of nowhere and says, "Can I help you find a seat? Welcome to church." And they'll bring you to a seat, and there'll be some, often some like placeholders, or some like little place cards on your seat that's for offering. And one says, "Welcome home, you belong," just to give you more information. And so you can give money to the church. And then you sit down and the music is still playing even within inside. And then a pre-roll starts, which is like music to get everyone standing and jumping. And they go for the music. And it feels like you're in a full-on concert. All of a sudden, a mosh pit forms in the front of young people just jumping up and down as if it were a concert. And you're like, oh shit, this is pretty cool. So then you're in it, you're kind of feeling in the vibes of the typical emotional manipulation to get into it. And then as you are they start putting music to slow you down, a pastor will come up or someone will come up and give a message, and they will have an offering message for you. So they're asking you to give money, and they will then, after they ask you to give money, then they'll play another song, and then someone else will come up and preach. And it's usually about a 20-minute preaching, where they'll just talk about a random thing that feels more like a motivational speech than any scripture. And then they'll sing another song at the end, and you'll go home. So it seems
Really? So it's only 20 minutes of preaching?
Probably about 20, 25. It's not very long. Their focus it's on the experience. It's not specifically on that. Maybe at the end, they'll have like a minute or so of like, if they were able to emotionally manipulate you enough that they'll ask you, or they'll ask the question of like, does someone want to accept Jesus? And they're like, the typical evangelical, like, with everyone's eyes closed, like, bow your heads. We're going to go through this. Like, if you want to receive Jesus, like, raise your hand. So it's like a super, super big experience. But you'll have like people counting who are in charge. And so we have to collect all those numbers. And that's pretty much it.
Collect the numbers of who raised their hand?
Mm-hmm.
What would you do with those numbers?
So that's like, you would keep tabs on those to see like what was happening, the growth that was happening within the church. You would account for those in like, are these people actually being connected, or are they just raising their hand and moving on with their lives? So it's a way to kind of have an understanding of like what's happening. So that's a typical Hillsong Sunday. Maybe after church, you'll go and back to the welcome lounge as you're exiting, and there'll be even more people shouting at you, trying to get you connected, selling merch. Because there's definitely a merch table where you can get books or t-shirts, albums, like everything.
Okay, so then at what point did you start to feel like this wasn't the right church for you?
It probably took me about a year. So I was going through the motions, super excited. I started my own Connect group, which is like a small group of people that meets during the week, for people who spoke Spanish. So I wanted to kind of recreate what I had experienced in La Fe within InterVarsity in college. So I found that by saying Spanish speakers would get the most Latinx or Hispanic people within a room. And that was really cool for me to be able to have that and to be able to connect with people in a more intimate way. And I grew in leadership within the events team. So I became a service lead. So I was more in charge of volunteers within the events team. And it started to become quite a lot of responsibility and was taking up a lot of my time during the month, or during the week, I'm sorry. And having to go to grad school and having to have internships and volunteer within the school in order to have a good resume for after grad school. It was becoming overwhelming, and I was starting to kind of have difficulty with my mental health. But I was also starting to question my faith and sexuality a lot more. I had a crush and I couldn't hold back anymore. And I was like, I don't know what to do. So I started researching on my own. I started listening to a podcast. I Googled, can you be queer or can you be gay and Christian? And a lot came up from all sides of the conversation. But I found this website called Queer Theology, and that was super eye-opening. So I'm getting all this information and I'm like loving it and I'm getting really excited. And I'm like, oh shoot, like I go to this church, I don't know. And I'm technically like a leader within it. Like, I don't know if they're okay with this.
Yeah.
So I call my leader and I let her know. I'm like, hey, I have a friend who's gay and they want to go to church. Would they be welcome? Like, what does this look like? I've never asked this question before. And she was like, well, if they want to come to church, yeah, sure. And I was like, okay, but what if they also want to volunteer? And she was like, oh, well, that's a case-by-case basis, and we would need to have a conversation. But they can definitely come on Sunday.
Case by case. Guys, like, what's going to change case by case? Like, either yes or no.
Yeah, so then I'm starting to get frustrated because I'm like, wait, you're leaving me with more questions than answers. What do you mean by this? Like, how... And she starts getting frustrated and we're obviously over the phone. So I'm like, you know what? Fuck it. Like, it's me. I'm this person. I'm the queer one. And I don't know what to do. Like, I need to know if it's okay because I grew up knowing and wanting to be respectful of your beliefs so that if I know it's not for me, I can leave. And she was like, well, let's see. You're in the events team. So that's pretty much background work, and you help lead a connect group. That's not very theologically because you just kind of connect with people, so you don't talk too much about the Bible. So yeah, you're okay. Whatever you're doing is fine for now. And I was like,
okay,
for now, like, what does that mean? Where are we going with this? So we start getting into a huge debate about the Bible and like, homosexuality and this, and she starts saying like, I feel like you should identify as a child of God instead of just being like identifying who you are, but we'll keep talking about this. And I was like, you know what, like, let's leave it at this for now and we'll continue later. So we left it at that. We obviously still had more conversations as we went. But the shifting moment was when I came out to my mom and she didn't take it very well. And I had to do it over the phone as well. And this was already in 2019. So I had to talk to my mom over the phone and come out to her over the phone. So I didn't feel safe, both financially, physically, emotionally. And I had to find safety for myself within the church.
Yeah.
Or I had to find safety within myself for myself. And so when that happened, I then called my leader because she had become my friend. She had gotten so close to me that we were friends now. And I feel like that kind of became a tactic as well to kind of keep tabs on me. So when I call her and I let her know, hey, I came out to my mom, we were supposed to hang out the next day. And she was like, okay. And I was like, can we not talk about this tomorrow? I'm not feeling too good about this topic right now. So I get to her place the next day, and she had said it was fine. So I get to her place the next day with coffee because I hadn't slept. And she was like, so what happened with your mom?
Oh.
And I was like, I thought I told you I didn't want to talk about this. Like,
Really?
This is the last thing. And she was really kind of frustrated with how I responded, because I told her, I was like, hey, I don't want to talk about this. And she's like, okay, but like what happened? Why did you feel the need to tell your mom?
That's the wrong question.
Yeah. I was like, well, because it's who I am, and I want to be all of me, and I don't want to have to hide anymore. I'm tired of hiding. So she was really frustrated and goes into like, well, what is identity? Identity is elusive. She's like, I believe that identity, we should only identify in Christ. We should only identify as a child of God. And I was like, no, like, identity is not that. I've studied identity in college. Identity is like a multiplicity of things, and it's a lot of who you are, and it could be made up by so many things in your life. By your experiences, by what you feel internally, externally. It's so many. And she was like, no. And I was like, how could you, as a Black woman, tell me that I shouldn't identify in this other big part of me? Like, should I then not identify as a Latinx person, as a student? Like, does none of that matter? And she's like, well, yeah, no. She's like, I don't identify first as a Black woman. I identify as a child of God. And then the rest, maybe. And I was like, oh my God, no. Like, what is this? I was like, there isn't like a hierarchy of identities. It's just all a clump of who you are.
Right.
So we had a huge conversation on that. And that started giving me a mind trip. And my mental health after that conversation, a few like weeks and months later, started going downhill. And I started to have suicide ideation, and trigger warning for that. I ended up having to go to the mental health hospital because neither this leader, who then became a pastor, nor other pastors within the church knew how to support me within this mental health crisis. And to clarify, I was not having a mental health crisis because I am queer. It was because of my external experience that I was going through, and of people rejecting me, and of people pushing my identity or denying that I even existed as a queer person. My family had rejected me. The church was pushing me aside. I was starting to be ghosted by a lot of my friends within the church. And so it was like a whole bunch of things were happening all at once. And my mental health couldn't take it. And plus I was in grad school, which is like one of the most difficult things to do. Well, one of the most difficult things I had to go through academically. And so all of that was just weighing on me. And my mental health went downhill, and I contemplated suicide. And that's when I had to go to the hospital because I had a plan. And I ended up being in the hospital for about 2 weeks. And I remember the difference in support that I received from one of my friends from grad school. Her aunt was a pastor, and she was Black, and she was gay. And I had never met someone who had all of those identities in one, and expressed them all openly. And so when I called her, or she called me and asked to talk to me because my friend was opening up to her, like, hey, Noemi needs help. I don't know what to do. She was like, oh, I've been prepared. I went to seminary. So she ended up calling me, and she knew her limitations to how much support she could give me. And I remember the first thing she said on the phone was, I've heard you've been having a really hard time. And as soon as I heard that, I started crying. I was like, yes. And she's like, I can't help you, but I know that there are people who can help you, who have the capacity and who have the professional like accreditation to be able to help you. And I can guide you to them. Is that something you would want right now? And I was like, yes. And she's like, okay, well, I've gone through this before. So this is what I had to do. And she started telling me step by step what to do, where to go, what to say. Because often people who are in a mental health crisis, they get overwhelmed by everything they have to do. So if you list out like a checklist, kind of how they have to go about their treatment or getting support or getting help, they'll go through with it. And so she listed a very simple way and told me that there'd be people around me to help me if I didn't know how to go about it. And that was the only reason why I ended up going to the hospital that day and getting a psychiatric evaluation and being admitted into the psychiatric hospital. Like, I needed help. I needed medication, and that was okay. But no one else around me knew how to do that because the pastors at Hillsong kept saying I needed to pray. They would bombard me with having to do devotionals and having to write things down, saying that I had to go to church on Sundays despite me not wanting to or not feeling the ability to do it because I had been crying the night before all night and didn't sleep. So it was like all of these things. They would shake me, yell at me, like nothing was helping. But yet this pastor who I had some relationship with, but didn't know too well, knew how to help me because she had the qualifications to do that. And so I noticed a stark difference in that. And when I was in the hospital, no one from Hillsong went to visit other than two friends. One of them was the leader. But none of the pastors, like formal pastors from the church, went. No one sent a card, flowers, called me, texted me, nothing. This other pastor who, my friend's aunt, she went to go visit me. She followed up with me. She asked me what my care plan was afterwards, how I was going to implement it to keep me accountable a little bit. Not pushing it, but like kind of as a friend checking in on me, like, hey, how's it going? And that felt really good for me because I felt like I needed someone just to keep me accountable, but not to be in my face about it.
Yeah.
So that was really cool to see the difference. And it was very eye-opening from that perspective. And so that was kind of the moment when I started to put my foot out the door. And I did stay until that happened in like June of 2019. I stayed until December. And right before I left, the leader that I was with before felt like she could no longer convince me to not identify as a child of God. So I was pushed over to one of the pastors, like a higher up above her. And I had to meet with him for what he called mentorship. And within this mentorship, it was basically the same thing where he would try to convince me to not identify as queer, but as a child of God. And that was like frustrating for me. And it felt like I was repeating the same cycle I had done before at my dad's church.
I think the most aggravating thing from my perspective is this church is the problem, yet they're trying to be the solution by force feeding you the problem and then telling you that there is no problem. Guys, you're just totally sidestepping the actual issue here. The issue is non-acceptance.
Yeah.
And the way that you're trying to fix non-acceptance is by not accepting me. Like, it doesn't make any sense.
That's exactly how I felt, yeah.
I mean, you must have thought you were going crazy because it's just gaslighting. They're just pretending like everything's fine. And
Yeah.
no, you're fine. You just have to not be queer. No, you're fine. Or in less words, you have to identify as this instead. Not even acknowledging you in the way that you're identifying, not even acknowledging that that's part of who you are. It's like, yeah, that's fine, I guess. Maybe. Let's just not talk about that. Let's talk about you being this instead, and just trying to erase your identity completely.
Yeah. Yeah. And it was very eye-opening because after all of that happened, at the end, the last meeting I had with the pastor was where I finally got straightforward answers, because I was like, I'm done. Like, I need you to tell me what the policy is. Would you as a pastor ever marry me and my partner who happens to be of the same sex? And he was like, well, and finally he said no. And I was like, would you ever hire someone who's queer, openly queer, in this church? And he kind of went around it and was like, finally like, well, no. And I started getting all of these answers, and I had learned how to ask questions now from leaders after having done all this research on my own. And when I finally got this straightforward answer that I wanted from the start, if I would have gotten that from the start, none of this would have happened. So when he finally said no to everything, I was like, okay, like, thank you. This is all I needed to know. Like, from now on, I am officially going to start not coming to, like, slowly pushing away, because I have responsibility. So I'm going to find someone to take over my responsibility, because I want to be respectful of that, and find someone to take over. And then once I'm done by December, I'm officially gone. And he was like, oh shit, like, I kind of fucked up. So he was like trying to find a way to convince me to stay. And I was like, nope, like, I'm not here to ask you. I'm letting you know.
And I wonder if, and I'd like to get your perspective on this, do you think that no one was giving you a straight answer because they knew if they give you the straight answer, then you would leave right away, and they wanted to save your soul? They wanted you to go through this conversion therapy or whatever it was that they were trying to pull on you, and like, no, if we just like don't give her the truth, if we're not honest, then maybe she'll stick around, and maybe she'll come to realize that that's not who she is.
Yeah, that's exactly what they were trying to do, because later on, after leaving, I did learn that what they were doing was a form of conversion therapy. So Hillsong had a history of being of affiliating and collaborating with a conversion therapy organization in Australia. And when that became unpopular there, they pushed away and said they never had that partnership. But they continued some of the practices within the church. So I learned that the mentorship that I had gone through, I wasn't the only one. That a few of my friends within the church who I knew were queer, we were kind of like a quiet little group that we would meet together. I found out that they had gone through it too, and they were being told similar things. People in California were going through it. And they were kind of getting this model from another church called Bethel, who does, they have a group within their church where they call Changed. I believe that's what they call it. And it's basically people who no longer identify as queer or LGBTQ, but as a child of God. And that God changed them, and they're now heterosexual, and they now have a family and kids. That's conversion therapy. That's modern day conversion therapy. And Hillsong is being a part of that movement. And that was really frustrating for me to see that, because within the laws of this country and of states, churches are often excluded from the list of who can have conversion therapy groups or like any practice within. Like, churches aren't included within those lists when they have a conversion therapy ban. So that's been something that's been really frustrating for me now as an advocate, trying to have those conversations just with legislators and advocates of finding ways of how we can have and keep young people safe within a church.
Wow. That is insane, and I'm so glad that you came out on the other side of it. So how are you doing now that you've been through all of this and it's been a couple years? Like, where are you now?
Yeah, so now a lot has happened since I left. I started speaking out. I left in December of 2019. I started speaking out in like June. I felt like I had a voice again, calling out pastors on social media. And as soon as Carl Lentz was fired, um, Carl Lentz being the pastor from the East Coast in Hillsong, he was supposedly fired for moral failures or something. He had cheated on his wife. Obviously, we know there was something bigger behind that, but they didn't want to go into that. But reporters were finally interested because he had been the pastor to Justin Bieber and to a few other basketball players here or there in New York. And he was like a celebrity pastor. That's how people knew him as. And so the media wanted to get more information from churchgoers who had left or who were speaking out. So we kind of had an avenue finally. So I was within an article with Business Insider where I share more of my experience as a queer person within Hillsong Church, and that opened the doors to be a part of the Discovery Plus documentary that's called Hillsong Megachurch Exposed. And then now I'm working with another company to do my podcast, and I'll share more of that later in the coming months. It's almost done, but I don't want to give too many details. Trying to keep people excited about that. But that's more of what I've been doing with my story. Just trying to talk with people and to share about the dangers of churches being ambiguous and of pastors being ill-equipped in general when it comes to mental health. And personally, I'm working. I'm part of the Massachusetts Commission for LGBTQ Youth within the state.
Amazing.
So I'm one of the vice chairs, and I get really excited to be able to have a voice there and help out within state legislation. And see how we can make this state better, at least for LGBTQ youth, and protect trans kids and protect all LGBTQ youth. Yeah.
That's amazing. I'm just so happy that you're doing this work because it is incredibly needed. I know that people have been suffering from things like this for years and years and years and years and years. And finally, it seems like in the past 2 years, people are starting to speak up, and they're starting to realize their voice, and they're starting to actually demand change. And I love that so much within the religious communities because it's so incredibly needed.
Yeah.
And you're working with Ashley Easter on this shameless plug here. So she's doing an online event. It's free to abuse survivors October 1st through October 30th through her Courage 365 platform, which she created, and it's called the 30 Days of Courage. So you're going to be a speaker on that, which I'm going to tune in for that. I was a speaker last year, and it was awesome. It's so cool to connect with people. They're having other amazing speakers like intimacy coordinator Sarah Scott, forensic psychologist, I believe, and they do online interactive support groups, giveaways, prizes, and things that promote healing. So I'm excited to check you out on that.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's my first live event in that way, so we'll see how it goes.
You'll do great.
Thank you. I'm excited to share a bit more and to talk with folks a little bit deeper and in a different setting there. So yeah.
Oh, that's amazing. It's only just beginning for you.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you would like to share before we do our Linda Listen moment?
I think for folks who are probably thinking about what happened with my family, they are now fully affirming after years of conversations with them, having to spend COVID with them because I quarantined there because I didn't want to be in my little apartment. I was there for about 6 months at a time, and my mom kind of started realizing that I was the same person, that nothing had changed. I had just opened up this part of me. Which is the reality for so many other queer people. We're the same. The only thing is that you know a little bit more. about us. And so that was very eye-opening for her. We started studying scripture together and the history behind it, and the fact that homosexuality was added to the Bible in 1946 because of a mistranslation. And so that was really eye-opening for my family, and they decided to leave their church this past year. And that's been really cool for me to be able to see my sister, who is also queer, finally come out of her shell, and be more of who she is, and see my other sister being a huge ally who sends me pride boxes now.
Yes.
And my mom just like embracing it and embracing the fact that she doesn't know, but she's willing to learn more, and having conversations and being more open. And she says that love is more powerful than any theology, than any church. And if God is love, then she also needs to exemplify that with her kids. So yeah.
That's so beautiful. It gave me the goosebumps just now. That's amazing. I love seeing the ripple effect that you're having on your inner circle, and now with this podcast, which we will not talk about yet, but will be coming out, and speaking on Ashley Easter's platform, and just like, it's so amazing what you can do when you really come into your voice and you come into your power, and you don't accept no as an answer, and you say, no, I'm going to speak out, and I'm going to warn people about these pastors who, like you said, are ill-equipped to handle certain situations. And I'm going to speak out about how, no, the Bible doesn't say that. It was added in 1946. Like you just said, I didn't know that. That's really cool information. So congrats on just being an awesome human being.
Thank you. Thank you. It means a lot. Yeah. I know often we hear it, but it's good to hear it constantly. As a survivor, a religious trauma survivor, you kind of learn to just go with the flow and put a smile on, but often the reality is different internally. So yeah. Thank you.
Absolutely. So here we are for our Linda Listen. Is there something that you would like to say to maybe someone at Hillsong or anyone in general that you just want to nail in, or anything that you want to say to our listeners? Something you can say with conviction, your Linda Listen moment.
I would say Linda Listen to Brian Houston, who was the former and it feels good to say former because we got him to quit. Former global senior pastor of Hillsong Church. I would say, Linda, listen, you hurt so many people, and you need to take ownership and take accountability for the damage you have done to millions of people around the world. And pay me back for all of the therapy, and pay me back for all of the hospitalizations and medication that I have had to take in order to recover, for seeing the words, welcome home.
Yes, preach. Linda Listen is about to get real. I love it. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story. I know it's not easy. It's a very vulnerable thing to speak in public about something that is so hard, and something that I'm sure you're still working through. I'm still working through my faith crisis that happened like 10 years ago. So it's not easy stuff. So I really appreciate you taking the time, sharing your story. You're going to help other people who watch this and listen to this. So just thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. And it was great meeting you and talking with you.
Okay, Noemi, how can people follow you? How can people support you and find what you're working on?
So I am most active on Instagram. So you can find me as my first name. So Noemi, Noemi, and then add another MI. So Noemi. That's just me. And you'll find me on Instagram. I have links in there for if you want to learn more about why homosexuality was added to the Bible in 1946. There's a lot of resources in there for LGBTQ affirming resources, mental health resources, and everything. So that's where I'm most active.
Great. Well, I will link all of that information below. And then you let me know when your podcast comes out or when anything else comes out that you want a little shout out for. I'm here for you.
I will. I'll let you know. We kind of want to keep in the DL right now until we have more information. So I'll keep you posted.
Perfect. Well, to everyone else listening, follow your highest excitement, be conscious, and be well. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, it would mean a lot if you could like and subscribe on YouTube and leave a review or a comment to help with our visibility. You can also find me on social media at cults2consciousness or reach out by email at cults2consciousness@gmail.com.